Humankind's Victor OpenDev is over, and with it, countless games played with millions of turns inside of those games having been accrued. The stats for Lucy OpenDev blew me away, so I hope that Amplitude compiles some new stats for Victor quickly so we can see the impact. Hello everybody, this is Havoc, and welcome back to my Critique to the Dev series, where I dedicate an entire video to constructive feedback and criticism for games I'm passionate about. These videos serve three purposes. First, it creates a dedicated video for developers to view feedback on their build. Second, it allows the community to comment on my own criticisms or comment on their own criticisms. Third, it's a place for positive constructive criticism, regardless of how critical the feedback is. Comments are heavily moderated by myself, where vulgar, destructive, or personal attack comments are not tolerated. The Amplitude team was thankful for my last critique video on Lucy OpenDev and enjoyed the feedback they received from you, the community, as well, so let's do them a favor in this one and repeat that success. So in today's video, we'll dive into my time playing Victor OpenDev, the critiques I have in a few key areas that will mimic the last OpenDev video, and onto some concerns I have for the future of development as we head towards the August release. Let's dive in. UI, UX, and notifications. I wasn't kidding when I said I would mimic the last video, and while the UI and UX of Humankind made some decent steps forward in Victor, it still has a good ways to go for me. It's important to remember that nailing the functionality and the clarity of both of these is pretty dang key for new players and what will help Humankind truly stand apart in the genre. Now, from Lucy OpenDev, there have been a decent number of changes in a positive direction. Notifications give more information than they used to. You now see on the left-hand side whether you're getting close to unlocking an error star, and some overall improvements to layout or spacing have made the UI much clearer than it was before. There is nothing that has changed that I disagree with, but there were still some things lacking in my opinion. Diplomacy was an area of decent improvement but still had lacking features. There was a bug that didn't show the newly named regions when negotiating peace treaties, so there was still no way to accurately or quickly understand just what regions you were getting in those talks. This is 100% known to the team, by the way, and will definitely be fixed, possibly with an added feature to focus on that area once you've selected it, but I still needed to mention this missing feature in this video. Continuing with diplomacy, a lack of truly comprehending the feelings of other civilizations around you meant that diplomacy overall was still largely a gamble, and only a few times during my time playing did I know for certain that I could push certain treaties towards friendlier nations. It's my hope that we can still get some form of negotiation table or indication on the chance for acceptance based on attitudes, and especially some way to influence the opinion of other civilizations through gifts or something of that sort. Fix these, Amplitude, and you've gone a long way towards improving a large part of the game in general. Moving along to another section of UI and notifications, and I still have issues with the menu breakdowns and notifications and how they are represented on the main screen. I focused a lot on trade this time around, and what I noticed is that while trade is calculated on a per city basis, we still had a very lacking menu breakdown on the main screen gold accumulation. When I hover over my gold in the top right of the screen, it would be fantastic to see a breakdown of gold generated from districts, from trade routes, or other forms of that generation. Knowing that overall I'm making bank from trade is a given when I have tons of resources or are just making a crap ton of money, but I want that breakdown to see exactly how I'm making it, and if it's worth it for me to be trading said resources, or if I could be making more money by trading with someone else. It's the same with notifications. I received a notification every time someone purchased one of my resources in trade. Got a nice little bag of gold for that, and an increase in money generation, but no clue as to the specifics of both. Seeing a notification down at the bottom that says, hey, someone bought a resource for 55 gold and an increase of money by +2 would be crucial information, so I'm not standing around wondering where the gold came from and what resource I sold for an undisclosed amount per turn. The last remark in here is something I've seen a few other times as well, and that's the addition of a science meter in the top right corner. I can see on the bottom left how many turns I have before the next tech is researched, but it'd be great to see that I'm generating 1200 science per turn without digging into the tech menu to find that information. It's a seemingly small thing, but we already have other valuable numbers up there, and I would definitely consider science generation one of those important numbers. Game balance. I can tell that Amplitude spent a good long time looking at game balancing, as this area saw the most change, influence city reworks, stability, food and population, district generation, cultural balances. There's a lot from Lucy to Victor that created a slower game pace and at times a much harder experience than what we had experienced before. And yet there's still a decent ways to go, and I'll just say it right from the start of this section, I'm not entirely sure how to tackle some of these, so I'm hoping you, the community, might be able to help. Starting with city resource generation. There was and is still an imbalance with food, production, money, and influence. At the start, they work great. Everything seems pretty balanced and not too outside the realm of being unbuildable or cranking out too many people. All buyouts are high enough to feel the hit, but not outside the realm of being too expensive. There comes a point, though, where, again, steamrolling occurs, and that point arrives way too early in the game. It wasn't much more than 50 turns in that I was able to buy out dang near everything I wanted thanks to my money generation, without using a money-focused culture at that. It was maybe 60 turns in that I was almost to the point of creating a pop per turn, allowing me to easily fund large armies, buying them out with my vast coffers. Anything I couldn't buy out was built in almost at most 3 turns by turn 70 due to the amount of production in my city. I was able to do this, a person who is terrible at min-maxing games, so I can imagine what those min-maxers were doing in their games probably much earlier. This is an area with multiple solutions, but what seems the most logical to me personally is scaling production and buyout costs. When you build the same type of buildings or you buy out units, as well as when you progress through the eras. What we saw in Victor OpenDev was a minor uptick in production cost scaling every time you built a district, which is a great start, but a 10 to 15% increase in production cost per district never outpaced my scaling of production value, especially once I built the city improvements, so I never felt the impact. I'm not implying that the scaling needs to be boosted to something like 30% or more after every district is built, but what if that 10 to 15% worked on top of, say, a 25 to 40% increase for every era progression? A smaller gradual scale on top of large boosts would reduce the steamroll we experience with production. Buyouts are a bit of a different approach. I saw a lot of threads across Reddit and games together that said certain buildings or improvements should not be eligible for buyouts at all, and I have to respectfully disagree entirely. Limiting money to a few certain things would not hold over well in the scope of the entire game, and it would only cause more money hoarding and allow players to spam out those few things that money would be able to buy. But what if every time you bought out a district, or a unit, or even an improvement with money, that saw a massive scale up in cost? Because money is so easy to come by right now, it's not unreasonable to slap on that 30% scale I just mentioned. It would still be feasible to buy out anything in your empire, but that cost would scale so quick it would discourage mass buyouts like we saw repeatedly in the game. The same can go for units and their ties to population. There comes a point relatively early on where you can match population generation with unit production on a 1-to-1 scale every single turn. Increase that production scale, but also increase the population scale as well, where the later in the game you get, the more population it requires to produce a single unit. It's possible that this would also limit army spam, which is another issue with the current build. Since there is no apparent army limit, like there is with cities now, the steamroll production, money, and population will continue to be an issue unless you present a situation in which the player has to make an actual hard choice between building anything and the costs associated with it, no matter the era. I'll quickly roll into food and population as I've mentioned it a few times without context. The move to population just requires a surplus, and then that extra surplus, whatever it is, giving you a percentage boost is a great move back, but I still feel like it needs work. There's not enough food consumption in the game currently to ever outweigh food surplus, a continuing issue with Humankind. I had the same thing happen from Lucy OpenDev. I rarely built farmers' quarters for food generation, relying instead on city improvements and eventually harbors for every bit of my food requirements. I was always in a surplus and quickly got to the point where I was generating a pop per every 1 to 2 turns without issues. Scaling food requirements is one way to go about it, even though by now I'm sure you're tired of me saying scaling. But another potential solution that I saw was requiring every district and/or army unit generated in that city to require food consumption. It's an interesting idea for sure, and I honestly had never thought about it. Sure, the people are already consuming food, even if they don't have a job, but on top of stability, it would help the player make some decisions about what to place in those cities. And then there's something like Total War Thrones of Britannia, using a food consumption mechanic for its units, where they have a monetary upkeep on top of a food upkeep. This could be beneficial for Humankind as well, as specialization would potentially become more diversified as you balance where you build your units from and what those cities look like from a production and food perspective. There's one last area of game balance that I had a bigger issue with, and that's in the realm of your military. First, I think it would be a great experiment to test generals and their effects on an army generation like we have with cities and administrators. In this, you would receive some serious debuffs or increases in upkeep if you go over that number of armies, not units. Neolithic Age army spam is still 100% a thing, and we still have issues with the Huns and the Mongols despite the new rework for both. It's way too easy to army spam thanks to production, population, and money production in the game, and something needs to be curtailed in order to balance it desperately. Second in the realm of balance is battle initiation, and this is another area I'm not quite sure how to fix, and it's also a pretty huge issue for multiplayer. With simultaneous turns and the battle mechanics as it stands now, the offensive player wins a vast majority of the time as they get to move first. This means that if an army of 4 units attacks an army of 2 units, there is very little hope that the defender will ever get to actually have a turn. This creates a massive imbalance in the game, especially for multiplayer. It gives no incentives to be defensive, either in playstyle or with regards to battles themselves. My only idea would be that yes, the attacker can attack first, but every one of the defenders gets a big defensive bonus, or that the attacker can pull off a sneak attack and only one of the units actually gets to attack before the defender gets a bonus. It's nowhere near perfect, and I hope you guys and gals watching might be able to provide a better idea on how to fix this issue. I am very legitimately concerned for multiplayer in this facet alone, so I hope Amplitude can figure out a way to address this appropriately. Oh, and lastly, please, for the love of everything right in the world, do not remove a reinforcing army's ability to move if the defending army retreats. It ruins so many levels of strategy for your military and was hands down the most frustrating part of Victor OpenDev. A player should not be punished for strategically overwhelming an enemy army with reinforcements, and they should be able to track down a retreating army and fight it again using those reinforcements. But goodness gracious, man, that was so frustrating. I'm sure there are more areas that I can think of for game balance, but these stuck out to me the most, and it was near constant in regards to feedback that I saw from the community. While I'm no developer myself, I hope the suggestions make sense and are somewhat easy to accomplish. General feedback. This section is for all the random misfits and bits that don't work in other categories. They're still important, so don't disregard this part. My biggest general feedback would be in the realm of your Navy and naval development, where naval combat and gameplay was supposed to be the biggest focus. In every era, naval development is at least somewhat of a later tech, which largely removes the incentives to pick certain cultures that focus on it. Sure, I can use that in the next era, but only when my sole objective was to make that culture building did I ever get it accomplished, and even then, I sacrificed a lot to get to that point. In the 6-ish games I was able to play, I never had a single naval battle. The AI rarely built the units. I rarely built the units. And I picked the Norse because he gave me a transport boat that I could cross deep waters with. That's it. It was a bit disappointing, but naval warfare was just not something I could push effectively at any point during my time playing. Which leads to another general feedback point. Most of your unique units or buildings are locked behind later era tech, and it creates a big problem. Most of your unique units are locked behind later era tech, and it creates a big problem. Unlocked so late in the era usually means you don't get to use them very long in that era, especially in the first two. There are a few cultures that get theirs fairly early. In this case, creates a vacuum of power from a military standpoint, where you have your own base units while the AI can spam out their unique ones. It's also just a bit of a bummer for me, no other way to put it. What's the point of choosing a culture based on their unique unit if you can't ever build that unit in the era? Again, I'm not a min-maxer kind of guy. I like to have fun while playing, so maybe it is just my playstyle. But perhaps a sort of unique cost reduction towards your cultural tech could be the solution, allowing you to maybe reach for it sooner because it's cheaper, and that's a possibility. Not sure how balanced it would be, but making it easier to obtain your own unique unit would make the gameplay experience much better. Moving on to the AI, I felt like they were a bit more competent than in Lucy, thanks in large part to the difficulty settings actually working in Victor. But there were still some issues. Vassals were way too easy to obtain. I felt like they gave up way too often for both the AI and myself. The AI pushed grievances religiously for every single slight under the sun, but couldn't back them up in a war. I also found that most AI would push for the new era as soon as possible, causing them to, in the long run, lose out on the fame game as I quickly bounced back up. I'm not overly disappointed in the AI at all, just feels like they have some polishing to do in order to be a serious challenge for the player. My last area of feedback, the benefits from different culture focuses. This was one of the more largely discussed topics as well. For instance, the military benefit is 4 units immediately being spawned in a city to defend against attackers. But they are some of the weakest units in the game, rendering them somewhat useless, even if you are actually in need of them. Aesthete cultures don't get much incentive to use their benefits either, and it quickly comes to a point with regards to expansionists that it's nearly impossible to advance in this area of era stars once the map fills up, and it fills up fast, forcing a military playthrough instead of allowing for a more peaceful track should you want to do so. I've seen several more examples of lackluster benefits, but I've also seen lots of positive solutions. For expansionists, adapting cultural spread into the factors would be great, where if your culture is in a region, it counts towards your expansionist era star. Better units, as for military-focused garrisons. Aesthetes can have a form of tourism that can be generated to boost their appeal. There just seems to be the need to make each culture focus type a little more in-depth and involved in order to really see the player benefit from choosing them, and I wholeheartedly agree. Now that I've spilled out a good chunk of what I see needs critiquing, what are my thoughts on Victor OpenDev? How do I feel about Humankind as a whole? Well, still rather enjoyed myself. It was nice to dig into the changes and see what development had occurred through the last 4 months. I think the game has slowed down a decent bit, steamrolling ventures aside. It still feels natural to switch between different cultures as time progresses, and none of the combination of cultures I chose during this time felt off. But I'm also really glad they didn't launch in April, as disappointing as the news was. Humankind still feels heavily in a sort of alpha stage, and in my honest and critical opinion, needs these extra months into August to really bake the game further, figure out resource balance, work on military aspects, polish the AI, and provide a bit more uniqueness and depth to culture focuses. I'm very thankful that they chose to open up the Victor OpenDev to us to play and test, yet I also hope this is the last time we get to play Humankind. Anything more and I think it will end up hurting development and hype for release rather than help it. Amplitude now needs to ramp up blogs, teaser videos, and do some solid open-faced marketing from now until release. Let the community still have their say from what Amplitude posts, but no more hands-on experiences. I'm optimistic about the future based on Amplitude pretty clearly listening to the community feedback from Lucy OpenDev to Victor. They've had such a solid pass with their strategy games, and I have little doubts that in the next 4 months we will see a much more polished game than we've seen such far. But they do also have to really start working on multiplayer as well. It is one of the, I guess you could call it, biggest fears, is that multiplayer won't stand up based on what we've seen so far. So Amplitude, if you gather one thing, please QA test the holy living goodness out of multiplayer. That'll be all for my critique to the devs on Victor OpenDev for Humankind. As with all these videos, please give your honest and critical feedback, but remember to keep it constructive. Drop a comment based on what I've said in this video or anything I didn't mention. I know I didn't touch on everything. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to drop a like and sub to the channel. Also, tag the bell button so you're always there in the loop with content for this channel. Don't forget you can pre-order Humankind via my Nexus GG store, where your purchase will directly support myself, and it would be immensely appreciated. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. This is Havoc, and I will see you in the next one.